Welcome. I'm Celia Wexler, President of the Society of Professional Journalists, DC Chapter. Before our webinar and my introduction of Lee Gutkind, some housekeeping. I'll leave 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question, do not use chat. Put your question in the Q&A box. In the chat box, you will find links to the two stories that Lee will discuss that will be shared on the screen. So if you want to reread the stories, save those links. This session is being recorded. It will be available on the SPJDC website and on our YouTube channel. The URLs for those sites are also in chat. Now, it's my honor once again to introduce Lee Gutkind, a gifted writer of more than 30 nonfiction books and a teacher and founding editor of Creative Nonfiction Magazine. His latest book is The Fine Art of Literary Fistfighting: How a Bunch of Rabble-Rousers, Outsiders, and Ne'er-do-wells concocted creative nonfiction. This book is not only entertaining, it also explains why creative nonfiction matters. As journalists, we all want to write fact-based stories that are compelling. So enjoy this time with one of the masters. Lee, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Celia, for the second time. And it's just nice to be here and nice to work with you again. I have a couple of things, more than a couple of things I'd like to talk to the people listening and watching. But I wanted to start, and Celia, excuse me, I thought that when we began planning this, that you felt that some of the people who might watch us felt a little uncomfortable about the term creative nonfiction. And so I just wanted to just say what it is. Creative nonfiction means what it says. It's nonfiction, information communicated in a cinematic way so that readers will appreciate, enjoy, and learn. And it is mostly considered a fourth genre, so that the other terms that folks may use, narrative, nonfiction, literary journalism, any of the terms, the reported essay, they're all subgenres of this creative nonfiction umbrella. So, so that's kind of the way it is accepted and kind of the way that people think about it. But we are all, whether you want to call yourself a literary journalist or a creative nonfictionist, we're all doing pretty much the same thing. As I said, we have ideas, interesting people, and lots of information to communicate to our readers, and we want to do it in a way that they're going to continue reading. And so, speaking of readers, I always think of my when I write, I always think that there are two readers that I am writing for. I'm writing for the easy reader. That is to say, there are certain subjects that people are going to read, or at least be interested in reading. The easy reader, the more obvious reader, but then there's the curious reader, or the reader that that really doesn't care much about the subject, but there's an opportunity for the writer to grab those readers and teach them something, even if they don't think they really want to learn it, by writing it in a way that is an unusual and provocative story. And so that's what I do. I think of both readers and try to find a way to satisfy both of them. And if you're writing a book and you get those casual or those curious readers, the readers who won't necessarily obviously come to your subject, you're going to sell a lot more copies. So and satisfy more people and that's why we write, really. We're not writing for a lot of money, obviously, and so and we're not writing for fame and glory. We're writing to impact in one way or the other with our readers. So so one way of kind of doing that is which is following the theme here in some ways, making the most of what you have is not to write the stories that you are trying to write in an obvious way, especially not to enter a story in an obvious way. I keep thinking of one of my favorite students, name was Kathy, and she was in her 40s when she came back to Pittsburgh. She was born in Pittsburgh in a community of Eastern Europeans. And she then moved with her family to Alaska. But she really remembered all of the interesting stories that her relatives and friends' mothers told her about the culture that was situated around this community in Pittsburgh. So she came back and studied for an MFA, and her project was to write that story. And she was so frustrated. Every time she started to write, she was telling people people either what they already knew or boring people to death with the history of this neighborhood and the history of the culture. And so she was, as I said, she was really stuck. But one day she walked into a church in order to watch. She saw a sign in front of the church, homemade pierogi tales. And she walked in and looked around, and she saw tables upon tables of women who were really old, some of them with really gnarled fingers, and they were just really struggling to make these pierogies. And the priest told her, "Well, Kathy, this is the last time that this church for 125 years had this pierogi sale. But now everyone has died out who remembered how to make it, and the younger people don't want to make it, so this is it." And suddenly she had her story. She was going to write her story through the memories of the people who were making the pierogies, and also the tradition of making and selling these pierogies in this area. And people came, by the way, from all over. And so it was an incredibly successful story. And I always think when I talk to students, or even think myself, when I'm trying to figure out how to get into a story, I always say to myself, remember the pierogi. And just kind of makes me think differently. And another example that is kind of different and quite interesting, Jimmy Breslin, who was one of the original new journalists, was assigned to cover JFK's funeral, and there had to have been, I don't know, 1,000 journalists coming to New York for to celebrate or mourn JFK, and he didn't know what to write about, because everybody was writing about all the obvious things. How many people were there? The interviewing of the bodyguards. So he found a way. He interviewed and wrote a story about JFK's gravedigger. And here's the lead for that story. Clifford Pollard was pretty sure he was going to be working on Sunday. So when he woke up at 9 a.m. in his three-room apartment on Corcoran Street, he put on khaki overalls before going into the kitchen for breakfast. His wife, Nettie, made bacon and eggs for him. Pollard was in the middle of eating them when he received the phone call he had been expecting. So, a different way to enter into a story and tell a story that everybody else is trying to tell. And especially in the beginning, we have to work really hard to write a really good beginning that hooks your reader and keeps them going. Reader studies show that you will lose 30% of your readers by if you don't get them interested by the end of the fourth paragraph. So you really want to tell them a story that gets them involved and keeps them involved from the absolute beginning. And that story, I'm going to talk a little bit later about structure, which is something that I know a lot of writers don't think a lot about, or I think a lot of writers don't think a lot about because, frankly, I'm obsessed with structure. But we often think that when we have a terrific lead, we've done our job, but there's more to the lead that you use, the lead 2 or 3 or 5 paragraphs, depending upon how long your story is. You want to satisfy the reader, and you want to keep the reader with you. And so if you start with pierogies or gravediggers or whatever you see you want to start with in that story, the reader, not only does the reader get involved, but the writer makes a promise to the reader that if they get interested in your character and in the situation, that character and situation is going to be a thing that they're going to be waiting for, and that you promise to not let them go and go off on different tangents, and not ever go back to the way in which you started your story. So, whatever story you lead with, you need to remember that your the readers are going to be waiting for a continuation of whatever story you start with, off and on through your essay or article, no matter how long or short it is. And there always needs, if you really want to write a successfully structured story, remember the lead means leading the reader. Lead isn't just the lead of your story, it leads the reader through your story. And so, however you begin your lead and introduce your subject to your reader, somehow in the end, you need to go back to that reader or go back to that subject, and one way or the other, finish it off in that way. We call this, as you probably know, the narrative line. There is a line that goes through your story from beginning to end. So, just a couple of ideas that I had to introduce, the subject of structure, just making sure to continue to capture your reader, that whatever story you're telling, you don't let the story go. It's with you. Not every paragraph, but it's with you all the way through. And please understand that the reader will be wanting you to do that. that paragraph that I read to you from Jimmy Breslin is actually, if you look at it very carefully, it's a little scene or a little story. And scenes or stories, however you want to categorize them, scenes always have a beginning and an end. And this has the Breslin first paragraph has a beginning and has an end. And obviously, Breslin went much further and followed the gravedigger as he walked to his work and did his work. But that little, I think it's maybe yes, 6 lines, has a beginning and an end, and it has a lot of specific details. And that's something else that we need to look for in writing dramatic, cinematic nonfiction. Readers want you to give them details that they wouldn't necessarily imagine or think about as they read the story. And so it's a 3-room apartment. It's on Corcoran Street, and he's wearing khaki overalls. And his wife, Nettie, makes him not breakfast and eggs, not breakfast, but breakfast and eggs. And those details are important if we are watching, if we are writing a story while watching, or if we are writing a story via interview. As you are interviewing, and you're always, I should say, interviewing for story. I know that journalists want to make sure that they get all the factual information into their story, and I appreciate it. But and of course, that's right. But again, we are trying to embed the facts into an interesting story. And so, and these days, I'm sorry to say, with the internet so filled with information, there's a lot of information that we can get without asking more obvious questions to someone you're talking to. So I always try to interview for story. I interview, and by that I when I am interviewing someone and they tell me a really interesting story, I stop and I ask them to recreate it for me as clearly and in as much detail as possible. Most people like telling stories about their life and about the things that have happened to them. I have never had a conversation, interview, if you want to call it that, that people say, "Oh, I don't have time to tell that." Sometimes, if it's kind of amusing, they laugh and then tell you the story. And sometimes I'm recording the interviews, and after they finish telling the story, um, the person I'm interviewing has almost written that part of my story for me. So, interview for story, and even in your interviews, take a lot of time to capture your character, because you may well want to take the interview and turn it into a story or a dialogue between two people. All of these things lead you to becoming more cinematic and and by that way connecting to the reader. Just we always have to think about what our reader is experiencing while they are reading something we have written. I know my tendency sometimes is to think about what my editor's thinking, or to think about, oh my God, didn't I write the greatest paragraph? And that's, take your time to do that. But you're writing for the reader. And so, boy, I spend a lot of time just thinking about who that person is and how I can make them satisfied and happy. So I mentioned to you that this Breslin piece was a little scene, and it is. It has a beginning and an end. It has a very small narrative line. There's some action, something happens. All of those things are things that you need to think about when you're writing scenes, whether it's 6 lines or a page and a half or 2 pages. I keep saying scenes, and I'm sure that that you all know that scenes are really important. And to go back to the basic structure of new journalism, and new journalism, of course, slowly but surely um, um, kind of morphed into creative nonfiction. Um, New journalism was really popular in the 60s and early 70s, and it kind of faded for a while in the 80s, but the term creative nonfiction kind of took it over, and more people, creative nonfiction allowed or invited more people who were not journalists to try their hand in writing nonfiction that was compelling. Um, um, Poets and fiction writers um, were not turned on by journalism or nonfiction. I remember at the University of Pittsburgh, where I first taught, um, uh, my faculty was totally against journalism, and I wasn't allowed to teach a course called New Journalism because they hated that word journalism. It just seemed, I don't know, easy. Um, so I changed the name of the course to New Nonfiction, and I taught the course. So, so in the new journalism world, Tom Wolfe was probably the first person, maybe for a long time, the only person that explained what writers were doing when they were writing this new journalism. And he talked about using dialogue and describing your characters and making things happen. But the most important thing he talked about was what he called scene by scene construction. And the best creative nonfiction or narrative nonfiction, um, whatever you want to call it, today is still, to a certain extent, um, constructed in different scenes, scenes that connect to the first scene and connect to the last scene. And it's like when I talk to introductory students, I I talk about this TV show called Law and Order. Lots of people have seen Law and Order, and I'm sorry if you haven't, but you should, especially the original Law and Order, which was on for 24 straight seasons. And if you remember it at all, it would always start in the same way. There would be a policeman eating a donut or a woman walking her dog. Suddenly there would be shots fired, and um, and the policeman would run to wherever he or she wanted to go, and then the the two detectives, Lenny Briscoe and his many partners, arrived, and they interviewed the policemen and the witnesses. And then what happened? What happened was um, a commercial, and or two or three or five commercials, and then the story continued. Maybe the detectives were back at headquarters talking to their lieutenant, and that was enough. And maybe the lieutenant tells them to go pick up the suspect. and that was another scene or series of scenes, and then there were more commercials. And so a really basic structure that Wolf was describing, the scene by scene construction, was a scene which would get readers really interested so that the writer can tell the readers what he or she really wanted to tell them, information, ideas, and then the reader is, all excited again to read the story. And then there's a commercial information, and then there's story, and on, scene by scene construction. And the challenge then, but now especially, is to be able to write those scenes, to keep your readers involved, but figure out how to embed the information you want to tell your reader inside the story. And it's really not hard. Once you have told this story, there will be many ways, if you look really carefully, to figure out how information that you need to tell the story, to tell your readers, can be included in this scene that you're writing. I always like to say to myself and others that you write a scene, but scenes are elastic. Scenes are elastic. You can stretch those scenes out and fit in relevant information. And again, not to be repetitive, you write the scene and you embed relevant information in a way that fits, and the reader reads and doesn't feel that he or she is learning or working hard to learn. So what I'm talking to you about right now is a lot of hard work to find a story that in which you can story that you can write so that you can impress and keep a reader for as long as possible. And researching for story, interviewing for story is often very, very challenging, but really important. Wolf and Talese and Didion worked really hard to be able to do that. And the narrative nonfiction writers that you read today and creative nonfiction writers, you will see that that nonfiction has become very cinematic. And the people we are writing about are more alive. I always suggest that instead of referring to the people you're interviewing as your interviewee or the person you're interviewing, like fiction writers. And I always think of them as characters. How would I write about them if I was writing a short story, a fiction story? They're characters. And one thing that McPhee says in the beginning of this conversation we're having, that you have to make the most of what you have. And making the most of what you have is something, many of the things that I have told you, but to work harder, to find interesting and not obvious ways to tell a story, and to make it as cinematic as possible, but also to always remember that that fiction writers don't own the techniques that they use all the time, like description, and most important, dialogue. I always try and recommend to anyone I'm teaching or talking with to write as much dialogue as possible. When readers read, they read dialogue faster. In fact, if you have a section and you want readers to go quickly through it, then use dialogue, and they move faster. And if you have 2 or 3 or 4 paragraphs of prose, they move slower. But the other thing about dialogue, the many things about dialogue, is you make the people in your stories real people, and with dialogue, you can you can more easily describe how they act, how they look, instead of, I've seen a lot of pieces that will begin with a paragraph of the setting where you are, and also the description of the person being talked to, interviewed. But with dialogue, you can do that. See my hands? You can talk about how they talk with their hands. Um, they scratch their head. They play with their glasses, and you can describe them in an action-oriented way, not um, not a flat-oriented way. So they're talking. Um, you're describing them. You're describing where you are, if that's necessary, um, and maybe even in this conversation, this dialogue, you are embedding information that is really important. So again, try to think about using many of the techniques that fiction writers use on a regular basis, and like I said before, turn interviews into conversations. You can do that. Get, you can interview someone that has a great story and tells you a great story. And instead of just letting them tell you a great story, you can recreate it. You can start with the setting. You can describe them and let them just tell the story to your reader. Like, I keep using this word because I want to, like cinema. Like it's happening to them right now. So I just want to stress a couple of things that I said, and then what I want to do next is to take you to 1 or 2 of those stories, both published in Creative Nonfiction Magazine, and I wanted to try to take them apart a little bit, deconstruct them, to show you how you can communicate information in different ways and make your story as suspenseful and enjoyable as you possibly can. So I'm going to do that. Is there anything else I want to do now? No. Here's what I want to do. I want to take a drink of water, and then we can. Oh, let me. I don't know who out there. I don't know how many people are out there or who, but I started off with John McPhee, and I am so sad when I talk to students, graduate students, sometime, and I mention McPhee, and they don't know who he is, and it makes me so sad because John McPhee. There was a lot of animosity and conflict between the academic community mostly, about creative nonfiction. And journalists resisted creative nonfiction for a long, long time. But, but anyone, but I did not ever talk to an experienced journalist who did not admire McPhee and his many accomplishments. So 40 books, long pieces in the New Yorker for the past 50 years. So um, of I recommend that you kind of take a look at his work and see how he masterfully um, communicated information through stories and scenes, and also um, how he always talked about the fact that the most important thing that ever happened to him was his realization that he knew he was a good writer, his realization that um, structure or the shape of the story was the most important thing to think about, the shape of the story. And the more you develop your story, um, the more opportunities you get to communicate that information that you might want to communicate. And McPhee, um, even though his colleagues at the New Yorker call themselves reporters and often talk about literary journalism, um, McPhee adopted the term creative nonfiction, and the class he had been teaching at Princeton for years and years and years, which had, I can't remember what it was called, but it was close to literary journalism. He changed to creative nonfiction. So anyway, read John McPhee, because and all of his books deal with subjects, but the last two or three books he deals with structure, just like I'm talking to you about shape of the story, structure, and why he did it. So, okay, blah blah blah. I'm talking too much before I get to. I think I don't know what time it is, but I'll move forward and
Yeah, I think it would be a good time to start to do a little bit with my night with Ellen
am I
Hutchinson.
running out of time? Did I talk too much?
It's no, we have enough time. We have enough time.
You mean you don't want me to go on and on about anything else before I go?
I I think this is a good place to do Ellen. Yeah,
Okay, give me a second to stop coughing.
sure.
Okay, so I just want to literally deconstruct this story, My Night with Ellen Hutchinson by Bud Shaw. And Bud Shaw was an organ trans. Whoops, I think we lost each other. Oh, okay, got it. Um, if some of you may have read this piece, and some of you um, are just looking at it now, and that's okay. Um, Dan, can you show a little bit more? Okay, stop there. Okay. Um, and just a side light about Bud Shaw, I wrote a book about organ transplantation. I spent 4 or 5 years in that world in the 1980s when organ transplantation was still, um, I wouldn't say experimental, but it was pretty shaky stuff. And Bud Shaw was there in Pittsburgh training, that was the largest transplant center in the world then. And we had many talks about creative nonfiction. And he wrote this essay, and submitted it for a contest, and Susan Orlean judged this out of many hundreds of essays as the best essay. So he won a couple $1,000, and he was published in this magazine, and this piece was turned into a book, which has been through many printings. So he was a surgeon, not a writer, and but but he captured this this feeling of cinema and suspense, and ended up with a book. So let me just say, right in the beginning, that, and you'll see as you go through this piece, or you could just read it on your own. But I talked to you a bit about the narrative line and how this story begins. Um, um, there is a direct line from the way in which this story begins. And even though there are a bunch of scenes and ideas that go elsewhere, um, Ellen is always referred to through the story, and Ellen is at the end of the story. So it's the narrative line, it's the beginning, and which is carried through, again, whether 3,000 words or 30,000 words till the end. And so I love the way this begins. Um, most of that, I'm not going to read this all to you, but the way in which this begins not only immediately introduces the reader to the character and the voice of the character, but in a very um, in a way that doesn't seem like information. We begin to learn more about the transplant surgeon's life. This is information, although although it doesn't seem like information when the reader is reading it. And right away, I talked to you a little bit about Breslin's use of scene, use of detail, and at the end of the first paragraph, Bud, um, we knew it was morning when the hospital cafeteria was serving eggs. A really nice way to say it was early in the morning. A nice specific detail. And we don't know for a while why Ellen Hutchinson, if you look in the beginning, why Ellen Hutchinson is actually there. Um, um, we know more about the situation of the surgeon. But so this lead is filled with suspense and promise. But you can tell that um, we we get some Ellen Hutchinson in the fourth paragraph. The night I went to meet Ellen Hutchinson was a Sunday, but it takes us a lot longer for the narrator to tell us why he was going to meet Ellen Hutchinson. So hopefully, um, the reader stays with us or stays with the writer long enough, and hopefully, and I think this author does it, Bud Shaw does it. He sets the scene and establishes voice and mood um, without and introduces Ellen Hutchinson without necessarily telling us for a while why he who Ellen is and why he is about to meet her. So he continues on, um, and begins to set the scene more specifically in the paragraph that begins, "The night I went to meet Ellen Hutchinson, it was a Sunday." And here is a good example of describing the atmosphere, in this case, the literal atmosphere. He's on a bike, we know that, and we read the odors from the electrical short circuit, and We know it's Pittsburgh, not because the author says it's Pittsburgh. It's Pittsburgh because I most associated that smell with Pittsburgh. And we go forward into a little more, and we have what is the first scene that adds even more to this Pittsburgh smell and feeling, um, um, the feeling of being there. Um, um, I asked about my first week. We were getting started on transplant surgery, and here we have a character, Chester. Um, we don't learn very much about Chester because Chester doesn't really fit into this story, at least at this point. Um, and but they talk about the smell, dialogue. They again they the writer establishes or makes the scene and situation real through a conversation rather than through a description. And if you look at that scene or that story from, and you can when you get a chance, I asked about it my first week in town, and and the ending connects to the beginning. Not till after the Steelers game when everyone's too drunk to care. And now, another scene, um, um, or more information. Now on Sunday night, and we're back to the beginning, which started with Sunday night. So he's keeping the reader focused um, on the story he intends to sell. And we finally learn that he was giving or operating on Ellen Hutchinson for um, a new liver. And immediately dialogue, conversation with the husband, and and then information. Um, I've seen people die during surgery, but I was never in charge then. And then um, and then a long paragraph about how he felt about the people he operated on, and some of the people he operated on, and what happened to them, um, um, whether they were calm, whether they fell apart, information that that he kind of tucked in to these to his description and these scenes. And then right away, another scene. Um, and just an aside for a minute, I have this exercise, and it's called the yellow test. And I do this all the time, and I ask the people I'm teaching to even try it out. We know that readers respond to scenes more than they do to straight information or straight exposition. And so after I write something, and I'm pretty well finished with it, I take a yellow magic marker and I color in the scenes. And I hope that I have, I don't know, 30 to 40% at least, and maybe more, in scenes rather than in straight prose. And so when you go home, you want to do this and you give this the yellow test, you will see the yellow will blast away at you because it's all action and and all conversation from um, the beginning. So um, again, there's a conversation with the husband, and we learn through the dialogue why this surgeon is operating, and we already know that this surgeon's feeling maybe unsure of the operation, but and we see already that Mr. Hutchinson is kind of doubting the surgeon, Bud Shaw. But another scene that fills that page. And then what happens next is, to me, many scenes, lots of yellow. And then what happens next, and that really just delighted me and excited me, is you read this and the reader expects the obvious. The reader expects that the next thing we're going to read is the surgery. Makes sense. We're signs the legal document. The wife is ready to go, sick as hell, almost ready to die. And the natural thing would be, if not blow by blow of the surgery, but the natural thing would be the surgery. But not the case. He skips the surgery entirely and writes another scene beginning after the surgery. And look at the detail. Afterward, I found Mr. Hutchinson in the waiting room by himself. And look at the nice detail, which will come back in a minute. He's reading Ladies' Home Journal, and that's what they had in our waiting room. And we know that some volunteer put it down. So the hospital doesn't really take a lot of care in worrying about the family. And so here's the next scene. And it's a pretty powerful scene, as you will see when you read it. The husband becomes angry and hysterical, and the surgeon has to wait and listen and feel worse as every minute passed, and it goes on for a long time. But it's a very compelling story or scene, and we can feel how bad the surgeon feels, and the anxiety and the beginning of the first stage of grief for the husband. And so instead of the surgery, it's what happens in the waiting room when the bad news is given. And I want to stop there just for a second to talk about the interesting details that this writer uses. At the space break, where it says afterward, I mentioned the magazine. Right before the space break, he describes Ellen Hutchinson and Mr. Hutchinson, and the last sentence before the space break, he was missing a finger on that hand. An intimate detail, a detail that, again, maybe we wouldn't think about using, but that kind of detail makes you know that the writer was there. He hadn't parachuted it in for a story. He was living that story. And as you'll see as I finish this, the magazines come back as a story, and the husband's finger comes back as a story. Sometimes we find these special or intimate details that, again, the reader wouldn't necessarily know, and we bring it back to the reader more than once. And so, and the other thing that happens here that I think, again, really makes it real and believable. And the detail of the janitor who was wrestling with the floor polisher by the vending machines. This terrible moment for this man who lost what he described as his family. And this happens to us in important situations all the time, that we could be having an intense conversation with someone, maybe not having to do with death, and there's the noise of a saw off in the distance, or a motorcycle vrooming down the highway. And in this case, there's a janitor wrestling with the floor polisher by the vending machines. A really nice detail that makes it more natural and realistic. And as that scene goes on, you'll see in the paragraph that begins, "I asked him to sit down," the magazines come out. And the husband, is twisting the magazine into tighter and tighter roll. And again, something that we can connect with. And the repetition in the following paragraph, it was the index finger that was missing. So the finger comes back. And again, we can visualize this. And in the paragraph after that, I wanted to tell him what I thought went wrong. I said to you that I was surprised and so delighted that he didn't bore us with the surgery. But at some point, he gives us the important details of what happened in the surgery and how he felt about it, in a confessional way and in a scenic way. And so the reader does not walk away from not knowing what happened in the operating room, but it is presented in a different, non-obvious way that is that really shows the feeling of the writer, and introduces this guy Luigi, and who will come back later. So, if you move on down in the paragraph that begins, Mr. Hutchinson paced back and forth. The floor polisher comes in, coming closer and closer, and the surgeon couldn't make out what he was saying. So real. That's the kind of thing that happens to us in the world today. And then the janitor was having trouble with the polisher, and all the way through that long scene, we're seeing his confrontation or conversation with the husband, and feeling the husband's how upset and angry the husband is. And it's a long scene, but we learn more than just the conversation. We learn about what happened in the surgery, and it's made more realistic by the floor polisher. That kind of thing happens to us all the time. And finally, I talked to you about not writing, and the story goes on. The janitor leaves the polisher and walks out, and Mr. Hutchinson is still staring at the magazines and rolling the magazines, and the polisher is starting up again, and the magazines are open. The repetition of those details are incredibly memorable. And again, not to be repetitious here, it makes the story um, more real and more human to the reader who may or may not know anything about surgery. But finally, I was so delighted when I expected the surgery and it didn't come, and then it came in a different way. But one more thing. I thought when I read this initially that the story ended, the essay would end. I left him in the chair. A different man was running the polisher. He ran it gracefully back and forth in great sweeping arcs, moving toward Mr. Hutchinson's corner of the room. That was the end, I thought. But no, this guy came back with another scene. As you can see, with Ellen Hutchinson's cadaver laying after being washed on an operating table. And the lights were off, and the narrator walks over and looks down at Ellen and describes what he sees and the incision, the scar of the incision. And Chester comes back. Chester comes back. That's really cool that this guy comes back one more time, and they're both sitting and staring at the metal table. And there's more scene, more dialogue, as you can see, and a final surprise, the final scene, and the final surprise, um, um, the discovery of the man sitting on the floor. And it's the guy he mentioned way long ago in this piece, Luigi. And Luigi um, um, mispronounces, or it calls the gurney a gunny, which is kind of funny in that situation. But in the end, Bud Shaw and Luigi come together. And I wouldn't call it an embrace, but they come together. The two men come together. Luigi exhausted and way too old to do this work, and Bud young, but um, but his spirit, if not broken, just so upset. This young man, the first time he has a chance to do a transplant without his bosses around, and he lost the patient who's lying there at the table, and they sink together to the floor. Another scene. If you do this yellow test when you get home, I'm taking a guess. There has to be 10 scenes. It moves like a movie, like all the time. And then you learn so much at the same time. So I just love this piece, and I love the structure. And I recommend to all of you that you think about, when you're all finished, think about structure. Try to do that yellow test. Try to think about your reader and how you're going to keep your reader glued to your prose. That's what you want to do. That's who you're supposed to be serving.
Lee, we have a couple of questions, and I think Julie's question is really interesting, and it's 10 after 7, so I know we need to end soon, but Julie, what the limitations of creative nonfiction, the importance of dialogue you speak of, but can you make up conversations when you don't know exactly how they took place? I'm particularly interested since my larger project involves subjects who are dead and left little to no written material behind. how can you make up scenes that are nonfiction unless you know exactly what happened in that moment? I think that's
Well,
something a lot of people struggle with.
okay. Well, in Julie's case, um, under this creative nonfiction umbrella I was talking about is a big genre called narrative history, and historians um, manage this all the time, either by finding records um, or by trying as hard, and whether you're writing history or whatever, trying as hard as you possibly can to imagine what people said. But here's the thing. Um, it's fiction if you're going to make it up um, without telling your reader, remember, we're working for our reader, that that's what you're doing. So many writers get around that by saying, I don't know, by going through as much history and research as they can. But if you want to use this technique, um, you can imagine a scene and imagine what, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln said to his butler, based upon everything that you have learned. And you have to tell your reader that that's what you're doing.
I think that's really good. I think the other question, I don't know, Lee, is what if a reader wants something that the writer didn't anticipate that the reader wanted? And I'm not sure there's an answer to that. What if the reader wants to be satisfied in a way that you may not have envisioned? I'm not sure there is an answer to that. What do you think?
It would be good if we knew that answer, but
Yeah, it would be. It would be. Look, I think this is great.
I
Um,
want to
uh,
say one more thing, if you don't
sure.
mind.
One more thing, but we have to finish up in 3 minutes because we're then it'll be 7:15.
Okay, well, all I'm going to say is um, with Julie's challenging problem, um, write in the way you would like to write for your first draft. Don't worry about maybe it's legal and maybe it's not, and maybe he said this and maybe it isn't. You get a momentum, we explode with our writing. And so I say to everybody, whatever you're doing, um, worry about editing yourself, shape or sentences or whatever, but allow yourself to be the writer that you really are and just let it go. And then worry about what you've done that works and what you've done that won't work.
Thank you so much for a really stimulating hour and 15 minutes. And if you're a journalist and not a member of SPJ, please consider joining our national organization, spj.org. If you live in the DMV, please also join our DC chapter. And again, this is being recorded. So if you want to listen to Lee, that's going to be possible. It'll be on our website and on it's in the chat and also on YouTube in a couple of days. And thank you, Lee, so much for sharing so much of your expertise. We could have gone, you could, I'm sure, teach for a couple of hours or 3 hours, but I think we appreciated the pointers you made, the points you made, and you've given us a reason to buy the last book you wrote, which is the literary fist fights. And I don't think I had that right, but thanks very much. And thank you all for joining us. And have a good evening.
Thank you, Celia. See you sometime.